This is the 2014 Atlanta Press Club Loudermilk Young Debate Series from the studios of Georgia Public Broadcasting. Now, the 11th Congressional District. And good evening. I'm Jonathan Seri, an Atlanta-based correspondent for the Fox News Channel. We'd like to welcome our viewers and our live audience to the Atlanta Press Club Loudermilk Young Debate Series, originating from the studios of Georgia Public Broadcasting here in Atlanta. This is the debate between the Republican candidates in Georgia's 11th Congressional District, which includes all of Bartow and Cherokee counties and parts of Cobb and Fulton. Some of the largest cities include Canton, Cartersville, Kennesaw, and Marietta. And now let's meet the candidates. They are in alphabetical order. Former Congressman Bob Barr, currently a candidate for Georgia's 11th District. Alan Levine is a British-American information technology specialist. Ed Lindsay is a member of the Georgia House of Representatives, representing the 54th District since 2005. Next is Barry Loudermilk, a former state senator representing the 14th District from 2011 through 2013. Larry Mrzinski served in the United States Army for more than 25 years before retiring as a colonel. And Tricia Pridemore, a businesswoman and former executive director of the Governor's Office of Workforce Development. Now let's meet our distinguished journalism panelists. Max Blau is a staff writer for Creative Loafing. Christina Torres, a reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, covering state government and politics. And Michelle Worth is a reporter for WABE 90.1 FM. Tonight's debate will consist of 3 rounds, and for more information on the rules for each round, please visit the Atlanta Press Club website at atlantapressclub.org. Now let's get started. In the first round, each candidate will be asked one question by one of our panelists. Candidates will be given 60 seconds to answer the question. Michelle Worth, you get the first question to Tricia Pridemore.
Ms. Pridemore, there's been some uncertainty about funding for a pedestrian bridge over I-285 for a new Atlanta Braves stadium in Cobb County. If elected, would you work to secure federal funding for that project?
Absolutely. I believe that overall what we need to look at is a means to be able to get ourselves moving again. And I think that we need to do it in the most responsible way possible. I would like to see us take our federal transportation funds and explore new ways to where instead of just being allocated by congressional district, that we're looking at traffic patterns. We're looking at overall throughput of an area and work with appropriate federal and state and local authorities to make sure that we have everything that we need to make sure that the 11th District can move efficiently.
And Christina Torres, you get the next question to Bob Barr.
Good evening, Mr. Barr. Let's first start with party identity. You previously served 4 terms in Congress as a Republican. You then became a Libertarian and ran for president, and now you're back in the GOP fold. Why the change of heart, and how does that best serve the people of the 11th District?
Well, it isn't a change of heart. My heart has always been exactly where it is today in this race as a candidate for the 11th District of Georgia, and that is front and center with the Constitution. There was an article that appeared just the other day by Richard Gingrey, for example, one of the most well-known and most senior conservative leaders in Washington, and he wrote in his blog, Conservative HQ, that the reason that he supports, and many conservatives support Bob Barr, support me to go back to the Congress, is precisely because I do not shift aside or kick aside the Constitution and constitutional principles for partisanship or temporary reasons. So I've always been with the Constitution. I'm just like Ronald Reagan, who said in 1975 that the heart of conservatism is libertarianism, and that is smaller government, more individual liberty. That's where I've always been.
And now we move on to Max Blau, a question for Barry Loudermilk.
Mr. Loudermilk, the person that you're seeking to replace, Phil Gingrey, is a staunch opponent of the Affordable Care Act and has spent years trying to either repeal or defund it. And one of the reasons he's trying to run in the Senate is to do something in the Senate where he couldn't do it in the House of Representatives. As someone who is also trying to either defund or repeal Obamacare, why do you feel you can do something differently, and how would you go about it if you were elected?
Well, it's clear that we're going to have to repeal Obamacare. The situation is it's probably not going to be able to be repealed until we have a new president in the White House. But the reality of Obamacare is it can't work. I just received an email from someone the other day who talked about that their mother is in the hospital and she has the Obamacare insurance. But because of the cost of the prescription to take care of the liver disease that she has, they're denying her access to that prescription. That's entirely wrong. And so we have to get the patient and the doctor re-engaged in healthcare decisions in this nation. And how can it be that it's the government that's going to decide whether or not she deserves to continue to live by denying her the cost of this medication just because it's too expensive? Obamacare has to be repealed.
And Michelle Worth, it's now your turn to ask Larry Merzinski a question.
Mr. Merzinski, there have been a number of problems at VA hospitals throughout the nation, including here in Atlanta and in Augusta. As a veteran yourself, how would you change the U.S. Veterans Administration?
Well, that's a great question. I wrote a 10-point plan in 2012, and that 10-point plan still sticks. This is a leadership problem. This VA has not gotten into a situation overnight. What we needed in our veterans is to make sure that when the veterans come off active duty for number one, there is a seamless care. Right now, there's a 6-month hiatus between the care that they receive on active duty and before they receive it at the VA. I believe that we need to take a hard look at the care of the veterans in those VA hospitals and take a look at also the backlog. I've been a very staunch supporter of taking a look at our president, who has done $1,650 for Obamacare for IRS, but nothing has he written for our veterans to take care of the backlog. I think it's egregious. I think it'll be done, and I am the person in this race and in the United States that will fix it.
And now we move back to Christina Torres. Your question for Ed Lindsay.
Mr. Lindsay, good evening.
Good evening.
Let's talk about public education. In your time at the State House, you have been chairman of the Education Appropriations Subcommittee. Mm-hmm. You had worked, in your words, to diligently find funds for Georgia's public school children. That said, you've talked about maybe abolishing the Internal Revenue Service, going towards a national sales tax, all of which would affect funding for Georgia schools, including in Georgia. If you are elected to Congress, how would you plan to work towards public education and serving those needs?
I've been a strong proponent of public education. I've worked very hard to make sure that we will improve the present school systems within the state of Georgia. Unfortunately, they're not where they should be. That's why I've fought very hard for the charter school amendment. Matter of fact, I co-wrote that amendment and fought for its passage by the voters. And so I do understand the importance of it. Let me also add that I am the product of public schools. But what we need to do on the federal level is stop trying to micromanage public education. We need to simply send back to the state certain block grants and allow the local school boards and the state of Georgia, for instance, to assess the needs of our particular children in our state and then determine what should be done rather than have them dictated on the federal level. I think we see far too many dictates from the federal level when it comes to education. And what we need to be doing is releasing the local school boards to take care of their children. That's the best way we can have here in the state of Georgia to improve public education.
And Max Blau gets the final question in this round. This question for Alan Levine. Go ahead, Max.
Mr. Levine, you are running in this district. You are also running a separate congressional campaign in Hawaii and previously had been running in 2 other states. I think to a lot of potential voters, there might be some concern or questions as to why you want to be Georgia's representative and not Hawaii's. Why should voters vote for you in Georgia?
Well, I appreciate the question. I've asked this very frequently. What's really important when you run for federal office is that you go to Washington to solve the nation's problems. If I wanted to solve Georgia's problems, for example, I would run for the state Senate or the state House. I would win because they're fairly easy jobs to get, and I would work on Georgia's issues. Same would go if I moved elsewhere. But our problems are national in scope. In 3 years, I estimate that we're going to have another economic crisis like the almost banking failure of 5 years ago. And my main interest is in saving the economy. If our economy fails and we lose control of the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency of choice, we will see mass unemployment. So whether I run here or I run elsewhere, it isn't important. I would add that I am also running in Hawaii, and the race will be over here on Tuesday, and I have yet to register officially to race in Hawaii. So it could be officially or unofficially, I'll just move to Hawaii and run the race there.
All right, we're going to have to call time there, and that concludes our first round. In the second round, each candidate will ask one question to the opponent of their choice. Each candidate will have 30 seconds to ask the question, then the candidate will have 60 seconds to respond, and 30 seconds for a rebuttal. By random selection, Edward Lindsay gets the first question. Go ahead.
Barry, I'm going to ask you a question that a Cherokee voter asked me to ask you. Given the fact that you abandoned your state Senate seat so you could fulfill your ambition here today, and thereby cost the taxpayers in Cobb, Cherokee, and Bartow County over $100,000 to hold a special election to replace you, she simply wants to know when she should expect to see the check.
Well, I'd like to say thank you for that question, but let me just explain it to you this way, Ed. I was not going to campaign on taxpayer dollars. I didn't need to go prove a conservative voting record. I had a 9-year conservative voting record that I'm very proud of. The problems we're facing are in Washington, D.C., and I needed to focus my attention on resolving problems and coming up with solutions for the congressional district here, not campaign on taxpayer dollars. I didn't need to be in the state legislature during the time that we're running for this office, because I was not going to use that office just to pass legislation so I can have a push card or I can send out a press release that I blocked Obamacare, but surprisingly we still have Obamacare here today, Ed. I was not going to campaign on taxpayer dollars.
Well, let me point out to you, Barry, that 5 Georgia Republican congressmen have been able to walk and chew gum at the same time, meaning that they were able to both run for Congress and fulfill their duties without costing their taxpayers money to hold a special election. And when you talk about simply trying to raise your ID during the legislature, let me sort of explain to you some of the things that I was able to do that you did not do since you abandoned the seat. Yes, I attacked Obamacare. I made sure that Georgia taxpayer dollars were not going to be used to fund that ill-gotten program. Yes.
And we need to call time. Your time is up. And now, Larry Mrzinski, the second question goes to you. Go ahead.
Mr. Loudermilk, you trumpet that you're a conservative legislator. And as a career politician, how do you explain Senate Bill 31 for Georgia Power to have a blank check, and you voted 3 times, and you voted on the 3rd time to not have go to the Rules Committee so the Public Service Commission could protect the very people that are watching this program? That is not fiscal conservatism. How do you answer that, Mr. Loudermilk?
Well, Larry, first of all, I'd like to know how you define a career politician. You see, I'm a career businessman. I own a small business, an IT services business, and I keep hearing this idea of career politician. Well, let me tell you, I spend the majority of my time taking care of customers, fixing problems that my customers face. So my question, I guess, to you is, how do you define a career politician? As far as the vote goes, that vote had to deal with getting nuclear power to supplement the grid, that we were desperately needing nuclear power, and Georgia Power could not move forward with Plant Vogtle without that bill. And I'm proud of that vote. But I would like to know how you define a career politician for somebody who works 80 hours a week most of the time trying to keep people employed in a small business.
Mr. Loudermilk, anyone that holds and ties the hands of the Public Service Commission to protect the public and bypasses its own legislature is not someone that I want representing me in Congress. I think your conservative record does speak of a career politician, and your answer goes right back to the heart of what a career politician does.
Alan Levine, it's now your turn to question the opponent of your choice. Go ahead.
Mr. Loudermilk, I guess I'm picking on you as well. And I'm really picking on everybody. Everybody but me during this series of debates we have had have addressed leading constitutional conventions, term limits amendments, balanced budget amendments, and a variety of amendments to the Constitution, which sound good, but the public doesn't recognize that they are pipe dreams, since we've only had one constitutional convention, and that was over 200 years ago, in spite of 700 attempts. And there's been over 11,500.
Ask your question. We're running out of time.
Okay, there's only 11,500 attempts for term limit or for a variety of amendments, of which we have just a handful of those actually passed.
Well, I'm not sure I caught the question there, but I'll try to answer it. But let me say this. I think it's clear who the front runner is now, and I'll be glad to answer all the questions. But there's a misnomer regarding an Article 5 convention. I believe that's where you were getting with your question. There is no call for a constitutional convention under Article 5 of the Constitution. It's a convention of the states to come and act when Congress refuses to act. And you can clearly tell Congress has refused to act on a balanced budget amendment. Our founding fathers recognized, regardless of what party was in power, that any legislative body would be very hesitant to restrict their own power or their ability to spend money. That's why there's been a big push, and I even co-authored a bill in the Senate that passed the House this year, even though I wasn't there, that called for a convention of the states to force Congress into a balanced budget amendment.
Well, the trouble is the vote has only been one constitutional convention, and it does buy votes to say you want to have these variety of amendments and conventions, but the reality is there aren't any practical solutions. I'm the only candidate that actually has a practical solution to many of our problems, notably economic and how to fix Washington, because Washington has gone completely insane. They spend money unbelievably fast, and it has to stop.
Bob Barr, it's now your turn to question the opponent of your choice.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'd like to ask Colonel Brzezinski a question, and Colonel, it follows very much on the answer that you were giving very appropriately about the Veterans Administration. The Veterans Administration Appropriations Bill, or the appropriations for the Veterans Administration, has increased dramatically over the last 20 years, from 30-something billion to now in excess of, I think, 150 billion, yet we see the problems not being solved, but actually getting worse. With your tremendous experience as a career Army officer, are there some specific steps that can be taken, in your view, to help rectify that? Because obviously it's not just a money problem.
Well, Bob, thank you. That's a great question and very helpful to our listeners. You know, the same problem came up when I was in the State Department when we talked about nations and the use of money and the proper use of money. Well, the same goes for the Veterans Administration. It's about leadership. We saw, Bob, that Shinseki passed on excuses. It's a leadership problem, ladies and gentlemen, and that's what we need to take a look at. I think if we take a look at where the money is going, if we take a look at the backlog, I think we will relieve a lot of the future problems of our soldiers and sailors, airmen, Coast Guard, and Marines. Ladies and gentlemen, today there's those who are either taking their lives or giving up on life. And I think Mr. Barr's question gets to the heart of the matter. We need leadership. We need people in Congress. We're at the lowest level since World War II of veterans who understand the issues. And to march in my boots, I will do it in yours, and I will fix that, Bob, when I get to Congress.
Thank you.
Do you have a rebuttal, Bob Barr?
No, I think what the Colonel has pointed out here is something that is symptomatic of Washington, and that is a lot of folks think if we simply go after a particular individual or a particular bill or a particular issue, that we can solve the problem. What the Colonel has pointed out here is that the problems that we're facing, whether it's with the Veterans Administration or one of the other departments of Washington, it is a systemic, deeply rooted problem that goes far beyond any individual. I believe that's why it's important to send somebody with the experience to Washington to rectify these problems.
And now, Barry Loudermilk, your chance to ask a question of the opponent of your choice.
Well, thank you. Alan Levine.
Yes.
We've already had a question about the effects of the Affordable Care Act, and I know that you lived in England, which has a socialized medical system or healthcare system. Would you share with us what we expect here in the United States if we continue down this path with Obamacare? What challenges are we going to face? Because I feel you probably have some firsthand experience you could share.
Yeah, I'm the only candidate who has actually lived under national health, and I have the teeth to prove it. Whatever you think is going to be is how you think the what will become the single payer system once the insurance companies are taken out of the way in a few years, and the Obamacare will turn into a United States national health program. It will be twice as bad as you think it's going to be. Medical services will be rationed. Medical quality of service will be reduced. and taxation will be increased. It will do no good for this country to go down this road. The trouble is, it cannot be repealed unless there's a majority of Republicans in Congress and who are focused on undoing what has been done. The problem's going to be is that undoing what has been done is going to be very, very difficult and progressively more so.
Your rebuttal?
I think he emphasized why it is so important that we not only repeal Obamacare, but replace it with a patient-centered healthcare system. I stood in the hospital room of a friend the other day who was about to have triple bypass surgery, and he told me he didn't have insurance because he's a small business owner. And when he tried to apply for Obamacare after losing his insurance policy that he chose for himself, he was denied coverage by Obamacare because he didn't make enough. But the hospital told him, since he was going to be a cash customer, that his bill would be 60% less than under health care. We must replace Obamacare.
Tricia Pridemore, you get the last question.
Very good. Thank you, Jonathan. This question is for Alan Levine.
Yay.
Hey, Alan. In previous debates, including this evening, you have defined Congress as insane. What do you mean by that?
Well, the Congress has the approval rating lower than cockroaches, and yet the public votes in the same people over and over again. As Albert Einstein once said, the definition of madness is to do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. We need to replace Congress. While I do appreciate the other candidates here talking about term limits amendments, realistically they will not, or any amendments to the Constitution will not pass. The last one passed was 25 years ago. It took 202 years to pass. We'll be long gone by then. So what's necessary is a practical version of a term limits amendment to replace the people in Congress. And I actually have solutions on my website to boost the economy so we once again beat China to be the largest GDP country in the world as of December, and also how to remove long-term Washington politicians without needing amendments.
Your rebuttal?
I agree with Alan and Albert Einstein. I believe that the definition of insanity is doing the exact same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. I think that overall, that's one of the biggest reasons why I'm running. I'm running to send a fresh perspective to Washington. I'm the alternative to negative campaigning and career politicians.
Tricia,
For those of you just joining us, this is the debate between the Republican candidates in Georgia's 11th Congressional District. We will now go on to our third and final round. In this round, each panelist will ask a question to the candidate of his or her choice until we run out of time. I'll then determine whether a rebuttal is appropriate. Christina, you get the first question.
Thank you. Let me ask Mr. Barr, you talked about your experience. During your first term in Congress in 1996, you sponsored the Defense of Marriage Act. It's a federal law that denies federal recognition of same-sex marriage. In the years since, you apologized for your role in its passage. Do you talk about its repeal? Given that the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled parts of DOMA unconstitutional, where do you stand now on gay marriage?
Well, personally, I'm against it, but I do believe that, as with a lot of other issues that are facing and will face me again in the Congress of the United States, it's important, very important, to separate out, based on our principles of federalism and respect for individual liberty, individual decision-making, and the individual rights of the citizens in the different states, those issues that truly are federal issues from those that are not truly federal issues. And the ability, the right, the responsibility of the citizens in the different states to make decisions about how to live their lives, what relationships to foster and so forth, including the marriage issue, is very much right at the core of that. It's not a federal issue, and that's why, for example, in the Defense of Marriage Act, we made very clear that what we're talking about is leaving it up to the states to make those decisions under the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution. And that applies to many, many issues across the board.
Max, you get the next question.
This question is for Mr. Lindsay. As someone who has taken action to hinder the Affordable Care Act's implementation in Georgia, and as And as someone who, in Georgia, a state where there is Medicaid expansion has not been accepted, and there are estimates between half a billion and 650,000 people who are being denied health care insurance, plus putting some of the services of a hospital like Grady Memorial Hospital in jeopardy. What do you say to voters who may be low-income residents of Georgia in the district you'd be representing, or who would be receiving services from, say, Grady's mental health care facilities that could be at risk of closing if nothing happens there?
Well, first off, while Barry talked about politics, what I did was actually very substantive, both in terms of making sure that Georgia tax dollars would not be used to advance Obamacare here in the state of Georgia. The second thing I passed was a bill that would require that the General Assembly be the one to decide whether or not to expand Medicaid in Georgia rather than to have the governor, given the fact that it will have an enormous fiscal impact. What we cannot do is simply burden an already overburdened Medicaid system with up to 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 additional people when we already are having difficulty servicing their needs at the present time. What we need to do is move away from a government-based system and move toward a system that's being advanced by Representative Tom Price, who is calling for a market-based approach which puts the patient and the doctor squarely in control of the medical system. And when it comes to the individual, make sure that they get to decide what is the best way to get insurance to cover their medical care. That's how we're going to deal with the issue when it comes to low-income individuals, not an ever-expanding government program.
We have to call time there. I
Thank
apologize. Michelle, you get the next question.
Mr. Loudermilk, do you support the Common Core?
No, I do not. I don't believe that we should wholeheartedly just turn over our education system to the federal government, who can't even balance its own budget, who continues to spend more than they take in. They can't even manage their own affairs. Why would we want to hand over our education system to the federal government? When our education system was the best, it was when it was competitive, that we forced ourselves to be better than everyone else. Common Core just takes that away. In fact, 2 years ago, I co-sponsored legislation to pull Georgia out of the Common Core curriculum. Unfortunately, we have not been able to succeed in that, but I do not support Common Core.
Christina.
I'm not trying to pick on Mr. Loudermilk, but let me hop on that real quick, because Common Core, of course, had nothing to do with the Department of Education. It's not a national program. It was a business-led program. Businesses wanted kids who knew the same thing from any state to be able to do well worldwide. How do you then defend saying, well, it's the national government telling us what to do?
Well, from my understanding, it was being pushed through the Obama administration with the Race to the Top program. So there is a tie to the federal government with the Common Core standards. The problem is when you go to a one-size-fits-all, whether it's in anything, especially in education, you're going to go to the lowest common denominator. It takes away to the competitiveness. I would love to see not only get away from Common Core, but to get rid of the U.S. Department of Education. I think if we could get rid of the strings that are put on our education system and allow local governments to excel and compete, then we would see an improvement in our education system, not by just handing more over to a central authority.
Max, your question.
This question is for Ms. Pridemore. As someone who has been a small business owner for a number of years and worked in the Office of Workforce Development as the executive director, what specifically would you do to help unemployment in Georgia and create jobs? And in what way, if at all, does the minimum wage being raised play a part of that?
Thanks, Max. I believe that the hub of the conservative wheel is a job, and job creation is debt reduction. If we put more people back to work, we're going to see that $17 trillion federal debt go down. Well, at the same time, it lends people that sense of success that comes from having a job. They're able to provide for their families. They're able to put food on the table. And our economy is enabled to grow from that. I think that instead of looking at overall ways to increase the minimum wage, I'd like for us to look at the earned income tax credit and ways that we can supplement that so that we can do more to be able to not cripple small businesses by having them have to cut their hiring by paying more in wages.
And Michelle.
Mr. Barr, How would you protect Dobbins Air Reserve Base from being closed if there's another round of base realignment closure?
The pending, and it's almost certain to be here within the next year, or maybe 2 years at the most, of base realignment and closure actions, or BRAC as you correctly identified it, clearly illustrates the need to have somebody representing Dobbins and Lockheed, which is at the heart of the 11th District of Georgia, who actually knows what they're doing, who has the experience fighting these battles in Washington against the tremendous bureaucratic and short-sighted fiscal proponents who would close down one of the most important bases and military installations in our reserve system, and that is Dobbins. So what I would do is exactly what I had the opportunity and did in the prior round when I served in the House of Representatives representing then the 7th District, which included Dobbins, and that is to begin now to marshal the community assets, marshal community leaders, and use my knowledge of where the buttons are to be pushed in Washington to get rid of those who would close down the base. We cannot afford it.
Next question goes to Christina.
All right, Mr. Lindsay,
Yes.
let's talk about immigration for a little bit. There
Okay.
is a court case pending in Georgia seeking in-state tuition for immigrants brought here legally as children. Nationally, President Obama has instituted a non-deportation policy for some young illegal immigrants, such as those involved in that case. Why should Congress, or why shouldn't Congress, pursue such a policy permanently?
But what we need to do is have Congress take a look at the overall immigration issues, issue by issue. The first thing that needs to be done is to secure our borders. That should not be negotiable. The second thing we need to do is draw a clear line of no amnesty for those who willingly and knowingly cross our borders illegally. To do so would be contrary to the rule of law. It would be unfair to those folks who've come here legally, and it would also simply not work. It didn't work in 1986, and it won't work now. The third thing we need to do is look at each of these issues individually. When it comes to how to deal with the children who cross the border with their parents, how to deal with immigrants who have come here and overstayed their visas, how to deal with students who come here on student visas and want to stay here. What we need to be doing is looking at each of one of those individually, and always look at every immigration issue from the standpoint of what is in the best interest of the American people.
And Max, next question.
This question is for Mr. Barr. You were in one of your rebuttals, you mentioned the need to look at Washington systemically as opposed to individuals. Earlier this year, in an interview, you had talked about the possibility of impeaching President Obama. You later clarified those remarks, but you also were someone who was obviously involved in your first stint in Congress with Bill Clinton's impeachment on proceedings. Wondering if you could speak to, why, in terms of talking about systemic change, why bring up the Obama impeachment this year? And I guess, what is your take on that now for people who aren't familiar with those comments that you made?
Well, what you had with regard to the Clinton impeachment was a president who violated the law. What we see currently is both a manifestation of the systemic problems in Washington, these institutions, these bureaucracies having grown so big and so powerful that they are almost unstoppable, and it's almost impossible to pinpoint where the real problems are. But you also see an individual, and that is President Barack Obama, who is taking the law into his own hands and undercutting the very notion of separation of powers. When the Congress passes a law, whether it's Obamacare, as we've been talking about, or immigration laws, or takes existing laws and directs through executive orders and other administrative mechanisms that he can use to direct that the laws not be filed, that they be circumvented. And then when you have others in his administration who enable him, that goes to the heart of what a president should not be doing and destroys the fabric of our country's system of government.
And Michelle, next question.
Representative Lindsay.
Yes.
During the recent state legislative session, lawmakers considered legislation to legalize an oil-based form of medical marijuana known as cannabidiol for those with seizure disorders. However, one of the main problems was that federal law prohibits the transporting of medical marijuana across state lines. If you were elected, would you either back legislation or introduce legislation that might help solve that problem?
The answer is yes. And let me sort of talk about the underlying issue that we saw in the General Assembly, because I think it speaks a long way toward how I act as a state legislator later and how I'll act in Congress. I had a mother and a child come and sit down and talk to me. She was a lot more knowledgeable on the issue than I was. We walked through the various scenarios. I talked about my various concerns to make sure that what happened in Colorado and California does not happen here in Georgia. She was able to answer those concerns and also point me in the right direction toward other programs and other type of documents to sort of educated me on it. At the end of our discussion, I told her, ma'am, not only am I going to vote for it, but I'll sign this bill. That's the kind of legislator that I've always been, someone who listens to my constituents, takes into account their concerns, and then tries to find a solution. I work for that passage of that bill here in Georgia. I will also work for that passage of that bill to help those type of families in the United States Congress. Thank you.
And next question goes to Christina.
Sure. I was going to turn it back to the economy, Ms. Pridemore. You talked about, maybe doing earned income tax credit versus a minimum wage and that kind of thing. But at the base of it, I think some people just want a job. And with your experience in the State Workforce Development Office, you talked at the time about the state producing 1 skilled craftsman for every 4 who retired. That's right. If you get elected in Congress, how do you help Georgia make those numbers better?
Well, let's start by encouraging the United States Senate to pass the Skills Act. The Skills Act takes all 23 federal workforce programs, combines them into one program, so it's easier and less expensive for states to operate workforce development and employment activities. I think it's a great first step to not only getting Georgia back to work fully, but the rest of our country. I think that it's those type of common sense solutions that are there that if we're able to set aside petty differences, work together, make sure that we're keeping our priorities set on job creation and on economic growth, that's how we can build our economy back. I think that when you look at the proclivity for people to go into the skilled trades, it's amazing when you look at the 84,000 open positions here in Georgia within the skilled trades. And if we encourage students in high school, maybe bring back shop class, look at vocational education, and a means to be able to help them know that they've got options and opportunity.
Next question goes to Max.
This question's for Mr. Lindsay. As one of the few, one of the only, perhaps the only now, the Republican Atlanta representative, you've been someone who has worked, obviously, with Democrats in the Gold Dome to promote policy to better Atlanta's interests, but you've also been someone who has taken a stand on things such as reforming Fulton County.
Yes.
If you were elected to go to Washington, what sort of, would you favor one or the other, or is there a certain way, would you be working across the aisle? Kind of what maybe speak to a bit of your political stance going into Congress if you were elected?
I've always believed that you should be prepared to negotiate without compromising your principles. And that's how I've been able to operate here in the state of Georgia. If you look at bill after bill after bill in which I've worked on with Democrats, it's not a matter of me adopting their policy, but rather convincing them of the wisdom of good, sound, conservative reforms. If you look at, for instance, the charter school amendment, in which I was able to pull in a large number of Democrats to vote for us, that was a conservative education reform that we got passed. When it came to taking on human trafficking, that was a conservative approach to a horrible problem that I was able to pull Democrats into conservative reform, the circle. When it came to economic development issues in our particular area, I was able to pull Democrats into conservative solutions. When it came to reforming Fulton County, I've been able to pull Democrats into conservative solutions. My history when it comes to Democrats is more than willing to sit down and negotiate with them. I'm not going to compromise my principles, but I will convince them to come over to our side. That's what I've been able to do in Georgia. That's what I'll do in the United States Congress.
And Michelle, your question.
Mr. Mrzinski, how would you fix the Federal Highway Trust Fund?
Well, thank you. I'm glad the era of the career politician questions are now over. We can move on for the people. Fix the trust fund. 84.0% has been returned in 50 plus years to Georgia. We are one of 9 donor states in the United States. In that 50 plus years, we have seen Georgia's money and those who transit Georgia for tourist money go to other states, the other 41. I think that we need to return that back to Georgia, and your state legislators, and oh yes, your Congress, has hid that from you over 50 plus years. that you have been a donor state. Under Colonel Mrozinski, you'll see no federal toll roads. Under Congressman Mrozinski, you will get this just the same. Honest, transparent leadership. And I will promise this to you, the Georgians. Your federal dollars that you spend at the gas pump will go back into Georgia. Oh yes, we'll return back to fiscal solvency and also making sure that our roads that need to be repaired, they're repaired. We have roads today that you could practically put a name on them, potholes that have not been fixed on federal highways. Under Congressman Mrozinski, that'll be my priority.
Christina, you get the next.
Let me ask one of Mr. Levine, if I may. You talked about your broad ideas, that most of them are economic-based, but you've also brought up some ideas, such as you want to carve out a backup territory for Israel inside the state of Texas. And I think you've also talked about creating a pathway for Chinese nannies to come to the U.S. and teach children how to speak Mandarin. Very broad ideas, but how do those help the people who live in the 11th District?
Thank you for that question. Let's start with the Chinese nannies. As of the end of this year, China's gross domestic product for the first time in history will exceed ours, will become number 2. I do not like that, and I have a plan to fix that through a very simple single bill that, if passed into law, will fix that problem. I also recognize, since I'm a practical man and I don't deal with fluff, my industry is in IT and I deal with solutions and not conjecture, is that it will be very important in the future to deal effectively with China, because they are a huge economy and it's growing very, very rapidly, currently at about 7%. As such, children who learn Chinese natively from Chinese nannies who are here on restricted visas will benefit greatly, because they'll be able to get jobs. Conversely, the Chinese nannies will go back and they'll be speaking English and they'll be able to go back. I also think it's time to come up with fresh ideas to solve some of our international problems. In Israel's instance...
And we need to call time. Max, you get the next question.
This question's for Mr. Loudermilk. One of the things you're campaigning on is to shut down the IRS and to kind of overhaul the United States' tax system. What specifically would you do to make that happen, and what does your proposal look like, and how does that benefit Georgians in your district?
Well, I think it'd be a huge benefit to not just Georgians, but the entire United States. Our tax system's clearly broken. A small portion of the working class Americans are pulling the weight for everyone. We have to have meaningful tax reform, not just talk about tax reform. I've actually been a proponent and working with an organization called the Simple Tax. The Simple Tax takes the ideas of the fair tax, but it takes some of the complexity out of it and simplifies it to go to a national sales tax, to where the states actually collect the sales tax revenue and appropriate it back to the federal government. That makes a lot of sense, because it re-empowers the 10th Amendment as it was intended to be by our founding fathers. But prior to going to the national sales tax, a flat tax would be immediately implemented so we can transition to the national sales tax, but only if the 16th Amendment is repealed, which it must be.
Michelle.
Ms. Pride-Moore, when it comes to abortion, do you support or oppose exceptions for rape and incest?
No, ma'am, I do not. I am pro-life. And I'm pro-life because it's a personal decision. I am married to my high school sweetheart. We have been together since we were young. And he was adopted as an infant. I can't imagine my life without him. And I can't imagine if his mother would have made a choice. I believe in exceptions for the life of the mother.
Christina, your question.
Colonel Mrozinski, Mr. Loudermilk talked about the simple tax. You've endorsed the fair tax, which, just so folks know, is an idea that would eliminate the income tax and replace it with sort of a national consumption-based sales tax. So I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second. Some critics say that might disproportionately benefit the wealthy ahead of the middle class. You have some economists and tax experts who also say it won't raise enough money, and a lot of people could end up cheating. How do you answer those questions?
Christina, that's a great question. The fair tax is the only way to go. We have 73 in the House and 8 in the Senate. The flat tax only has 10 in the House of Representatives and 0 in the Senate for representation. So we have a pathway to fix this. I think with the simple tax, Christina, they hit this. The simple tax is this. It's another kick the can down the road that the American people have heard before from career politicians. Simple tax, what is it, 2016 we'll talk about it? talk about it in 17? How about 18? The fair tax is here and now. We have that plan. And by the way, the flat tax will tax everything along the assembly line. The fair tax does not tax used goods. Now, how's that for creating jobs? The fair tax will allow people to take used items, refurbish them, and get them into the marketplace. No, the fair tax is here now. Simple tax is a diversion, again, to put it off. We need tax reform now in America. Congressman Rosinski will get you the fair tax.
Max, your question.
Ms. Pridemore, of your challengers in this race, is there a policy that stands out that seems most troubling to you, that you would discourage voters from going against? And so please explain what you would do differently.
I'm running on my own record of accomplishment. I'll let these gentlemen speak for themselves, and I'll let their records speak for themselves. I will say that one subject that's come up a lot on this campaign has been the subject of term limits, whether it's self-imposed or whether it's a law that's passed by the Congress. For me, I do believe in term limits, cumulative and consecutive term limits. I think overall that what we need to look at, though, is a means to have term limits not only for members of Congress, but also for bureaucrats and folks that run government agencies. Otherwise, it's just a transfer of power and authority.
Because she brought up cumulative term limits, I'd like to hear from the former congressman. What's your opinion on term limits in Congress, whether it be consecutive or cumulative?
Well, I feel like Rodney Dangerfield here to some extent. I'm the only candidate in this race who has actually done something that everybody else talks about, and that is voting for term limits. One of the first acts that we took in the Congress when I had the honor of going up as part of that large Republican majority in 1994 was to run through the contract with America, one of which points was to bring to the floor of the House of Representatives term limits amendment. I voted for it. Unfortunately, we couldn't get it through, but it is something that's very important to do. And I'm not among those who come up with interesting gimmicks about cumulative or some other focus to take us off of the primary focus, which is we do need term limits, and we need it in the Constitution. And I'll vote for that again and work to that end when I'm elected to the Congress.
All right. Next question goes to Michelle.
Mr. Loudermilk, what do you think of a recent federal climate change report which says the effects of climate change are becoming apparent and will get worse if not addressed? Here in Georgia, the report said climate change could negatively affect crops and reduce water availability.
Well, in my opinion, there's no doubt that we have climate change, but it's natural. I mean, we have seen a natural shift in the climate of the world over the past centuries. I recall we had a hearing when I was in the House of Representatives about climate change, where we brought in scientists, climatologists, all sat in front of us and testified, and all of them in that room agreed that there is natural cycles of change in our climate, that it's not necessarily man-made. In fact, one of them brought out a headline from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution from the late 70s that talked about the coming ice age, because there was a shift in the climate. There is nothing that Congress can do, there is nothing that any state legislature can do to stop the hand of God, the force of nature, for natural climate change. There are much more important things we need to be focused on, like an $18 trillion debt that is threatening the future of our children, not spending our time talking about something that we can have nothing to do with.
All right, and we have time for a very short question. Christina, you want to take it?
Mr. Lindsay, do you believe climate change is just natural?
Climate change has been taking place since the dawn of time and will continue to do so. What I don't believe is simply entering into speculative laws that will endanger our economy in the short run based on a theory that's not yet been proved.
All right, and that's all we have time for questions. Each candidate will now have 60 seconds for a closing statement. Barry Loudermilk, you get to make the first closing statement.
Well, first, I want to thank everyone at Atlanta Press Club and Georgia Public Broadcasting for putting on this debate series, because in 2 days, the people of the 11th District are going to make a very critical choice, probably the most significant decision that they'll make, not for their own lifetime, but for their children's future. You know, I've been campaigning on how important it is to give our children a future that is free, safe, and full of opportunity. They deserve better than what we're passing on to them. And that became a reality 2 days ago when I held in my arms my first grandchild. And that young girl, I realized the moment she's born, she is strapped with debt that she had nothing to do with. We face significant challenges in this nation, but it's challenges brought on by big government. We have an overwhelming debt that we must take care of. I believe we can take this nation back and put it back on course, and I believe we must do it. Why am I running for Congress? Because our children and grandchildren deserve better. I need your vote next Tuesday, May the 20th, so we can start taking back America for the future of our children.
And Bob Barr, now it's your turn for a closing statement.
My name is Bob Barr, and I ask for your vote on May 20th to represent the people of the 11th District of Georgia in the U.S. House of Representatives. What I ask the voters to do is to blow away all of the chaff, blow away all of the dust, get rid of all the extraneous issues, and focus on a very, very simple but fundamentally important issue. And that is, when our country is facing the problems, lack of leadership, runaway government spending, overregulation, overtaxation, is it time to send a rookie to Washington, or is it time to send somebody from the private sector who's been out there working, but who also alone among those candidates has the actual leadership experience in solving these problems? I was part of the team that actually did balance the budget. I was part of the team that actually did cut taxes. I was part of the team that actually did protect our individual liberties. If the voters of the 11th District send Bob Barr back to Washington to represent the 11th District, they know through my actual work and track record, I will do that again.
Alan Levine, you may now give your closing remarks.
Thank you. I'm glad that you are watching this debate. I also ask for your vote on Tuesday. We're in very difficult economic times, and I'm the only candidate that actually has solutions. I don't talk about conjecture. I don't talk about pipe dreams. I just talk about specific solutions that you can see on my website. Just yesterday, I was at a Georgia Tech conference, and I asked a man who was chipping away at some cement with a chisel where the parking lot was. And he said he didn't know where the free parking lot was, but he should, because he was a Georgia Tech graduate. And I said, really? And I asked him some questions. He said, yes, he was an electrical engineer, but he could not find a job. So if a Georgia Tech graduate, and I did write about it on my website, AlanLevineForCongress.com, but if a graduate from Georgia Tech cannot find a job other than chipping away at concrete, then what hope is there for the rest of America? I have actual solutions and can produce at least 10 million new jobs in America. On NBC...
And we'll have to leave it at that. We're out of time. And Ed Lindsay, now it's your turn for a closing statement.
On behalf of my wife Elizabeth, my sons Zach, Charlie, and Harmon, I want to thank the viewers for listening tonight. And I'm here tonight to ask for your vote for the United States Congress. The theme of my campaign is and has been Lindsay Delivers. In Georgia, that's meant taking on property tax and making sure that your reassessments have gotten frozen in tough economic times. That means going after illegal immigration. That means enacting good, strong conservative education reforms. That means going after Obamacare and blocking it from being able to use your tax dollars. That means fighting for a balanced budget amendment. That means taking on Medicaid fraud. That means a myriad of other issues that I've taken on here in the state of Georgia, where I've delivered on my promises. I have shown through 10 years in the Georgia House that I have the patience to listen, the strength to lead, the wisdom to know how to negotiate without compromising my principles, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to stay the course when times get tough. Thank you again, and I ask for your vote this Tuesday.
And Tricia Pridemore, your closing statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, panelists, Atlanta Press Club, and Georgia Public Broadcasting. I am a third-generation small business owner. My husband and I sat on our driveway with our friends. We dreamed up a product. We took the product to market. We served some of the nation's largest companies, and we built the American dream. We did that, and now I see the opportunities just slipping away. I want to make sure that you, your families, everyone has the opportunity to build the American dream. See, not all good ideas on how to change our country and how to make things better come from a dome, inside of one or outside of one. In most cases, they come from kitchen tables and boardrooms and cubicles. So this Tuesday, I humbly ask you for your vote in the Republican primary. Vote for someone who's a part of the community, who leads with her heart to make sure that we have a brighter future. Thank you.
And Larry Merzinski, you get the final closing statement.
Well, thank you. I first want to thank my family who's been with me on this long road to success. You know, every 2 to 4 to 6 years, ladies and gentlemen, you're sitting there in your homes. You've asked, we've tried this. We've been disenfranchised. Let's try it again. Well, I'm standing here. Help is on the way. And I promise you, as I promised my mother when I retired from the senior military advisor at the State Department, come home and take care of my mother. I saw health care up close and personal. I saw it on the battlefields around this globe. And I saw it also in the schools that I visited, and also as a Veterans Outreach Chair for the state of Georgia. And ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you this. If you want transparent, honest, and you want character, you will find no better. I will pledge to you, not only will I not take congressional retirement pay, not only will I self-term limit myself, but leadership starts with the candidate and continues with the congressional service. I pledge that to you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a brighter future, and together we can take it back. Do it on the 20th, and together we will make Georgia and America brighter to live once again.
And that concludes our debate. We'd like to remind voters that the primary election will be held this Tuesday, May 20, and early voting is already underway. Our thanks to the candidates and to our panel of journalists. We'd also like to thank the Atlanta Press Club for arranging tonight's debate. For more information about the Atlanta Press Club and all of the debates they're hosting this primary election season, you may visit atlantapressclub.org. This debate will be archived there. The debate will also be available on demand at gpb.org. Now, please stay with us for the debate among Republican candidates for state school superintendent. That's right here coming up next. The Atlanta Press Club Loudermilk Young Debate Series is made possible by a donation from R. Charles Loudermilk. I'm Jonathan Seri. Thanks for joining us. Good night.